Afternoon. It's 7 a.m. here in the US. So good afternoon. I'm Deirdra Preis, and thank you so much for joining this lunchtime session. I'm excited to be here. I'm an assistant professor of educational leadership and an inclusive excellence fellow at the Sacred Heart University, which is in Connecticut in the northeastern part of the United States. And I'm very honored to be here to meet with you and to hopefully have some lively discussion about preparing transformative leaders. So if you wouldn't mind in the chat, if you could please just share your name and location and the role you play in developing transformative school leaders. So I don't know if you're a professor or you're a internship coordinator or whatever it might be, if you could just put that in the chat so we can get a sense of who's in the room. And while you're doing that, so the challenge of developing transformative school leaders. Why have this conversation? Why have this conversation among colleagues who prepare school leaders? I know we're all working really hard to do this, and why have this conversation? So for me, I am a retired K-12 school administrator, teacher, dean of students. I've done everything from building leadership to curriculum leadership to discipline to, of course, classroom education. And when I decided to leave my position as an administrator and go into higher education to prepare transformative leaders, I did so because of what I was seeing in schools and what I was researching at the time of getting my doctorate. And I was really excited to be able to go into a world where I could spend much of my time researching, talking, and training leaders. But I didn't find it what I expected. And I found that I was seeing a lot of kind of like status quo and not so much the cutting edge that I was hoping for. And so, luckily I had some great colleagues and we worked together on all of us with transformation in mind to change curriculum and everything. But it's a very different world, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a second. And I found that one of the best things that I could do is to talk to other colleagues working in this field to talk about how they're doing this and what their challenges are and what specifically they're doing that's working. So that's what I thought we would do today. So just to get on the same page with language, I thought that we could define transformative leadership. And so what I did was I took a compilation from Shields, Gooden and Dantley, Johnson and Uline, a number of researchers who have discussed transformative leadership to a great extent. And I would say that, I boiled it down to these, 6 or 7 things, which is basically that they place ethics and social justice at the heart of their work. So they use they have a very strong ethical lens. They work with intentionality to ensure equitable educational access. They're constantly scanning to see where are we having a different experience among students and families and fixing those situations. They validate and develop community and a collective vision of equity. They do not work alone. They know that the solutions come from diverse perspectives and diverse decision-making. And they build the capacity of themselves and others to be critically self-aware and organizationally self-aware. And I love Uline and Johnson's term collective relentlessness. They have collective relentlessness around interrogating beliefs and policies and practices. They amplify the voices of those who are rarely heard. They actually pursue this and incorporate that into decision-making and problem solving. And they validate and leverage the cultural wealth of students and families, building an inclusive culture. So they're constantly looking at policy, pedagogy, and practices to see who's being served and what needs change. Is there anything you want to add to this? Is there anything that comes to mind that you feel should be here in this definition that you'd like to open your mic and just add anything? Or do you feel I've summed it up? Are we good with that working definition? All right. Great. So education, a tool for social justice? There's a question mark there. First, I had a period there and I said, I'm not sure. I think the question mark needs to be there. The vision, at least in the United States, Horace Mann is considered one of the forefathers of public education. He saw education as social capital and a social leveler in reference to hierarchy, economic wealth, and he saw this as a way to allow the lower income level to rise and avoid the hierarchy. Unfortunately, the reality is that public education, at least in the US, began around the early 1900s, a required public education. And it's unfortunately an offshoot of a system of sorting people and resources aimed at supporting that current social hierarchy and protecting Anglo norms and practices. So that's what it actually looked like when it started. And the dominant groups, which in the US are typically white, middle, upper income, middle or upper income, attempt to hoard the best resources, withholding them from certain groups. The groups that tend to be not getting an equitable access are students of color, immigrants, and lower income students. There are other groups as well, such as students with neurodivergence, things like that, which we'll mention later. And to maintain the social and economic dominance. Interest convergence, which obviously you probably know, comes from CRT, from Bell, this idea that we'll only let things change if the dominant class benefits from it as well, it's been pretty rampant all along. So this is what we actually see in the US. And I realize I'm not just talking to an American audience, so we're going to have an opportunity to talk about what you're seeing. And one of the things I would say here in the US and probably in other countries as well is that our changing demographics alone, aside from the ethical piece that I just referred to before, the changing demographics add urgency to preparing leaders who will transform the current system. Right now, we have a majority minority population entering our schools, yet the school leaders continue to be largely white and middle class, over 70%. The suburbs have seen the most rapid change in demographics. We see huge linguistic and cultural diversity. In 2021, multilingual learners were 10.6% of the student population. Most of these are US citizens. They're not necessarily immigrants coming in, but we also have a large immigrant population, which makes up about 26% of the student population. And the definition of that would be having at least one parent who's an immigrant. The need for trauma-informed practices, we all are seeing, I know this is international, large numbers of refugee populations. We have economically challenged families and other minoritized populations that may have more complex needs for trauma-informed practices. And we have an increasing neurodivergence in the population. I was shocked. I had not looked at the stats for a while. Right now, according to Maynor and in this article, 1 in 36 children are diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. That's huge. So these are just some of the changes, things that we did not necessarily see 25 years ago, and which many of our leaders are not necessarily prepared to address. So while we have a tendency to tweak our practices to remedy these disparities, unfortunately, the potential for the disparities are baked into the system. And it's a system of longstanding traditions and practices that many of us, myself included, benefited from being in a dominant class. We're not even aware that the system at the time was benefiting us. And that system sorts students and inequitably allocates resources. And much of it is perpetuated on old biases and meritocratic beliefs. So the changes and outcomes will ultimately require a major paradigm shift to a transformative approach. So that's just, a little bit of background. We also, in the US, and I think in education in general, that we have a culture of niceness, a lot of systemic pressure to not talk about race or inequities, anything like that, and a very strong neoliberal political paradigm pressuring equality over equity, meritocracy, things like that. So those are just some external pressures on school leaders and perhaps on preparers of school leaders. The fact is that many US school leaders still feel largely unprepared to address the growing diversity of their student populations, and many cite the failure of preparation programs to really acknowledge how hard it is to go in and actually make these changes and prepare them for real life work. Many of them have not had a lot of practice in critically reflecting on their own beliefs and things that may interfere with their ability to be transformative leaders. How do I manage resistance? How do I go in and try to avoid as much of it as possible, then leverage it when it's there? Strategies for database decision-making, and then avoiding decision-making practices that can use data to perhaps confirm bias. And then facilitating those tough conversations around race, things like that. And there's more. That's the fact here in the United States, at least. So why have this discussion today? You know, by its very nature, transformative leader, and I'd like to see that I try at least to be one, transformative leader seeks out diverse perspectives to support better understandings of how challenges are actually presenting themselves in a system. So I've presented some ideas of what happens in the US, but, you know, we can all learn from each other. And today's fellowship is an opportunity to share diverse perspectives and identify possible solutions. So we'll cover 3 key questions. What are the most prominent access disparities in your setting? What programmatic structures and practices have supported the development of transformative school leaders in your practice? What pedagogical practices promote transformative thinking and practice in your programs and courses? So those are things we'll be discussing today. So if we could just agree on a few things, that we speak from our own experiences only, that we give others a chance, obviously avoid monopolizing the conversation, assume good intentions, but let's hold each other accountable for inclusive language and behaviors. Accept and expect discomfort, perhaps, when discussing difficult topics, but know that we can feel safe and uncomfortable at the same time when we're having those hard discussions. And we're not going to experience closure today. This is the tip of a very large iceberg. So let's just hope that we can at least get some ideas out there, get some conversation, and maybe we take this over into the conference this year. So here's my question. First question. Can you share a current priority in your location that not only requires leaders to make a systemic shift, but requires that you change what you're doing to prepare school leaders to do so? Okay. So something that not only requires a major shift in the way we do things in schools, but it's actually challenging you to make a shift in how you prepare school leaders. And you can undo your mic, open your mic, or you can put it in the chat. But it'd be great if someone would start the conversation. What's something you're coming across?
Hi, Deirdre, this is Stephanie. I'm in the northeast of England. Thank you for your introduction and for this opportunity. This is, I think, probably a really big issue for a lot of schools around the world now since the pandemic, but we're facing a really serious recruitment and retention crisis in the teaching profession in schools and colleges. And part of that is about access to flexible working and the control that a school has over your time. And I think that's a massive systemic shift. And I think for less privileged people, it's an even bigger, or less privileged parts of the population, it's an even bigger barrier than it is for people who can cushion that lack of flexibility. So that's a really significant thing for us. And that because timetables are tight in schools and, you know, the students have to be supervised at all times, actually working a way around finding a flexible working structure that will retain teachers or will recruit new younger teachers who can see opportunities in other professions where they've got much more flexibility. Shifting that thinking is a really, really significant issue. And I think if we achieve it, then the opportunity to recruit from more diverse parts of the population, I think, could also be achieved as well.
Thank you. That's a huge one in the US as well, recruitment
Is it?
retention. How is it changing your practice? Like, what have you, what conversations are you having or resources you're providing that as you prepare leaders? Like, what are the conversations you're having?
So one of the big conversations that we're having is to ask people to think about why their mindset's fixed, and to ask them to think about the way their school day is structured and the way they timetable and the assumptions that they have always made. I think we're quite institutionalized in schools, aren't we? And this is how schools work. So one of the big conversations that we have with leaders is, what are the barriers to you thinking differently? And what are the different ways in which you could think? We also know that there are some institutions which are experimenting with flexible working. And so we're demonstrating models where people have made it work. And when that is resisted, we're then challenging leaders to explore. It's that thing that you were talking about earlier about critical reflection on your own beliefs. That it's easy to, because it's so pressured, to just think, with this, we can't change this. This is how we work. This is how schools have always been. But actually, they don't have to be. And it's not a sort of a challenge to children's safety if you change the way in which schools are structured. So we haven't found solutions, but our starting point is to have that conversation about, are you right that it can't be moved? And what are the assumptions that you're making about why it has to be the way that it currently is?
Right. So really that critical reflection on my own rigidity, my own,
Yeah,
lived experiences and how it's pushing me not to broaden my thinking. Great.
yeah.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Stephanie. Bernie, I see your hand raised.
Yes, hello everyone from Melbourne. Really interesting hearing you, Stephanie, because what I was going to say is very similar. So we teach a lot on weekends, and on Saturday I had to teach the session on leadership and diversity as part of the Master of Ed Leadership, and we go very much through transformative and what this diversity looks like as well. And I think it's an uncomfortable topic that needs to be spoken about, because if you have to face your own biases, you have to face your own assumptions, it's one of these topics where you cannot really separate the person from leadership and the whole value system. So I think putting people into that situation is good. It's a good uncomfortable place to be. And so I guess I'm looking at the second question. That's what we do. We look at case studies. We look at the literature, of course, but more than anything, we look at our own context in Australia. And in Australia, we're incredibly multicultural, and we're really good at being aware. But being aware is just not enough anymore.
Great point.
And so we've created this framework of looking at it where, diversity is visible. Historically, it's always been there, more now than ever because of globalization and other things. And then you come to visibility or awareness, and that's just not enough. That's just being intentionally aware that, that we have this diversity that exists. But then how do we go from that to representation, an intentional representation where it really matters? Representation for students, representations in the staff room, representations in that, and then from there to decision making. And that's where an area where it's in some places it's really good. In very decentralized systems like ours, where you have a lot of autonomy, a lot of responsibility comes with that, and it's really hard. Having a lot of autonomy is difficult, and we have to learn how to navigate that. And so what happens is that we have some systems or some schools that are doing this really well, like incredibly well, connecting with family, where the school is no longer just a school, but it's a school that forms real part of a society that is very diverse, with new refugee families coming in. So that's the area where we have to think about. But unless you look within, it's very hard to get them to do anything as leaders. They have to see their role very aligned with their own beliefs.
Right. Thank you. You both bring up some really important points about that critical self-reflection. Also, the pros and cons of centralization versus decentralization, and where does it tie our hands and where doesn't it? Where does it give us some freedom? So I think that can vary from country to country, district to district. So thank you so much for sharing those. And there are many, many more. We'll have more opportunity to share as we go along. So some of the programmatic barriers, if we look at actual programming, is that, preparation has largely been, kind of, filling the pail, and a lot of management-based discussions, again, based on an old paradigm. How do we manage the schools we came from, just like we were managed? A lot of compliance orientation, really a lack of focus on social justice and ethical obligations of leadership. Now, this is changing, but at least certainly when I went for my program, which was about 15 years ago, I mean, it was an entirely management-based type of thing. We never talked about even equitable access. There's not much of a focus on serving minoritized populations. As I think one of you mentioned, the concept is there perhaps, and I don't think people disagree with it, but what next? What does that mean for me when I go into my building, and what do I change? A very reflective versus reflexive approach. I've been doing research on this. What kinds of changes in the way I question my students and the kinds of activities I give them really can push that critical self-reflection. And I think insisting that people tie their lived experience to actions they're doing now is the way to really get them to do this. So asking them to reflect on an issue, you get just general, it allows a person to step away from themselves and sort of just not take responsibility. Whereas connecting lived experiences and then connecting, what am I doing now and how does that impact how I address this issue, has been something I've been really working on. Hiring, what some of the research indicates that the faculty often are they either don't have a lot of practical experience as leaders, they know the research really well, but they may be out of touch with actually the implemented challenges that their students are facing. So students walk around saying, you can't do this, like this would not work the way you're suggesting it. Or they have a lot of clinical experience, but a minimal understanding of the current research. So they're in danger of replicating the current system that they came from. And so we see this a lot in schools of leadership preparation. And also the way we operate causes a lot of programmatic incoherence. So schools often, the research indicates that schools often, in higher education at least, lack a collective vision around the outcomes in terms of equity and equitable access and sort of what we want, the brand, what we want our graduates to do in the field. Not a lot of focus on developing the will and the skill of the candidates. And unfortunately, there's a high amount of siloed practice where courses are created by individuals based on their individual beliefs and knowledge and skill sets. And that can be anything. If someone has a limited understanding of something that's really critical, they may not teach it in that course. So this programmatic incoherence means that the student is not getting this full, rounded, cohesive message and opportunities for it all to validate each other and practice. Oops, sorry. And some of the tensions of preparing leaders include, hang on just a second, I just want to move something here. Some of the tensions of preparing leaders, including just trying to prepare them for two worlds and admitting that this is really hard to do. You're going to have resistance. This redistribution of power will cause some resistance, just acknowledging that this is going to happen. Some people say, like, this all sounds great. And then I got into my position as an assistant principal, and I had no idea that people weren't going to think this is a great idea. And they're like fighting me on this. I'm not sure it's worth it. Finding opportunities for candidates to practice applying what they've learned in the field. Finding internship places with school leaders who are transformative in their approach, or at least open to change and improvement, can be a challenge. If we have 100 people that need to be placed in a semester, finding 100 leaders that are sort of state of the art and open to all this can be difficult. And again, our interns come back sometimes saying, I'm trying to do this and that, and my principal says, no, you just take care of this thing and, we're good. Once they graduate from leadership prep programs, there's also not much of an opportunity, at least in our region, for continuing education or fellowship with like-minded leaders. We need people who are doing this work in the field to stay connected because it can be lonely. So these are just some of the things that are tensions in preparing leaders, at least in the United States or in the region that I'm in. So I'd love you to share your thoughts around programmatic challenges and tensions. Where do you see pressures either from directly above you or external pressures from where you are? And what are some of the tensions that you're experiencing, such as that idea of having to go into a job where your foot is in two worlds? In the practical, you want to keep your job. You can't be a leader in your school if you get fired. But also a foot in the research and in the current, that idea of that tension that's there that we have to prepare them for. Would someone like to share their thoughts about this? What do you see as some of the tensions or some of the just overall challenges? Does any of what we talked about ring true? For example, the idea of program incoherence the idea that individual teachers create courses, and so it's not, a cohesive package for students, and things like that. Or are you being told that you cannot prepare leaders a certain way? Do any of you have places where leaders aren't required to get certification? So maybe you're preparing leaders in a different way than, say, at a university. Emma, you have your hand raised.
Hi, yeah. I teach in the West Midlands in the UK. And so I work as middle leader in a high school. So what we see in the UK, and I think probably colleagues who are here from the UK will see that, is that we do have leadership qualifications available for people in high schools. So we have a national professional qualification, which have been funded by the government. Until recently, they've been funded for all school leaders. Now they're just funded for certain demographic areas. I would say those qualifications have diversity and social justice as absent in their delivery. And so I think that there's like a gap there, where school leaders aren't instructed in those terms, and those are qualifications that are run by kind of accredited delivery partners funded by the government. So they are something that isn't necessarily creating that set of diverse leaders. Part of the things that I'm trying to kind of pull together for my research for my EdD is around what we can do within school around communities of practice and critical communities of practice to kind of address some of those issues, knowing that at the moment, the leadership programs that are being delivered aren't necessarily conscious of the need for there to be an appreciation of social justice and a desire for diversity. In our local area, our leadership is not reflective at all of the community it serves in terms of race and diversity. So that's something that is kind of going to be part of what I want to investigate. And I think that that's probably quite commonplace for a lot of schools that perhaps aren't in London or Birmingham in the UK, that their schools aren't necessarily reflective in leadership of the communities they serve. And that obviously does a disservice to our young people. Certainly when I went through my training program, we weren't even really told to be conscious of developing leadership opportunities for people from diverse backgrounds, for example. And I know that where we've offered them in school, they haven't been based in research. So schools have tried to offer really nicely programs for example, Black teachers, knowing that they are underrepresented in leadership in our area. And those teachers have turned down those opportunities because they haven't been developed in a way that doesn't make you feel like a token and like a diversity hire. So it's kind of lacking that research in how our leaders can kind of make a difference on that. It's not that they don't want to, it's that they kind of lack the ability to know what the right thing is to do in terms of developing those leadership positions.
Mm-hmm. Well, your point about standards too, and these guides, it's interesting how programs can get accredited by organizations that mention social justice and everything, but it's because it's so vague. Often it's not very specific about what it is they actually want you to do. And so I'm part of a council across the United States that is writing some very, very specific language about this. Things like, different categories, like making sure that students with disabilities are being taught by content area specialists. We have students in 8th grade who need to be in algebra who are being taught by a teacher who is trained in special needs, but is not necessarily trained in algebra. And so they're getting a very watered down version, and they're not prepared for them for high school. And so just something very specific like that is something that's important, because otherwise these standards are not that very helpful in guiding our programs, or at least that's my experience. So thank you for also bringing out that piece, how sometimes it's very under emphasized, this issue, the importance of meeting diverse needs. Stephanie.
I want to be careful not to hog this, but I really would like to echo what Emma said. I was involved in writing one of the MPQ programs, and we deliver them as well. And it was an enormously frustrating process because it was so politicized. And I think that's one of the really massive barriers to really changing the discussion around school leadership and school management in across the world, probably, but in Britain in particular. We've had a long period of time of quite ideological political intervention in sort of national programs, both the funding but also the content, and that is a huge barrier, because if it's not considered to be by the decision makers, the content that they want, then it's not there. And there's an explicit instruction not to include other things. And that's a massive barrier for us. We write bespoke programs as well, but that's regional, not national. And there's one of the other barriers to spreading better and higher quality diversity education for leaders in schools is finance, because our schools are so strapped for cash, they're not going to commission specialist training from people that have got the expertise that Emma's talking about. It's just, it's really underfunded in this country. Anyway, I could rant for the UN about that, so I'm not going to do it.
Well, you know, the impact of anti-immigration sentiment, right? On our schools. You know, things like that. Certainly the political climate here in the US, which is extremely tense right now, and things could change radically in 2 weeks. Yeah, I mean, certainly there's that, you know, anti-immigrant sentiment and, you know, nationalism and all those kinds of things, which is, I know all of the countries, many of our countries across Europe and of course here are experiencing this pressure to not provide additional resources to people that are not considered, you know, part of the nation or whatever the words you want to use, not worthy. Great. So I know there's many others. Does anyone work in a country or its district where school leaders are just chosen from the teacher group and there is no real leader preparation required? I mean, you can just raise your hand if that's your school. Anybody? Because I know in some countries, you know, there is no requirement for leader preparation. They have it available, but yeah. Okay, so we have a few people. Rayan, you raised your hand. Rayan, did you want to say anything, or we're just agreeing?
Hi, hello.
Hi.
So yeah, in my context, actually, I live in the UAE. I don't know much about UAE, but we work with several countries in the Arab region, like Lebanon, Jordan, Oman, Kuwait, and so on. So we don't have like serious certificates or certain programs, especially for principals or leaders, school leaders, and also the context, and this is also relevant to the study I'm now working on in my EdD, which is like this policy landscape in my context, which is very vague, which lacks a lot of clear standards or policies related to the principle and this like hard context the principles will work in when dealing with policies. So in some places, policies are vague, policies are absent, and at the same time, they have to be transformational. They need to lead change in their schools. They are also grappling with a lot of challenges, and this also makes their life even harder. So, yeah.
Yeah, and not everybody is required to get a certification, and people are chosen for leaders. There's a lot of research that says that schools in the United States, at least, choose leaders for qualities that will, for their willingness to adhere to what's going on at the time. And they're kind of vetting them when they talk about the word fit. What does fit actually mean? It means that we identify and we have some of the same ideas, and I'm pretty sure you're not going to touch my sacred cows. And so we tend to hire. And so that it's interesting because when people ask me if I can prepare them for a job to hire, you know, to interview, I talk about this with them and I talk about, what do you want to talk about? What do you not want to talk about? You know, is this the right bus for you to be on? You know, make sure, because, you know, whatever you say you're going to do, they're going to listen to that. They're going to be, you know, so yeah, great. So let's look at curriculum then. You know, some challenges might include, you know, developing a culture of criticality. We've talked about that, changing one's gaze, supporting their ability to recognize their own implicit biases and deficit beliefs. I know that I've been working with, how do you give feedback to a student who's showing meritocratic thinking? The idea of pull yourself up by the bootstraps, and the people who got ahead just worked harder. Savior complex. The majority of the people in my classes are white. And when they're talking about people of color, when they're talking about lower income, even when they're talking about students with who are not neurotypical or have other disabilities, we often hear language about sort of like thinking for them, doing for them, charity, all this kind of a thing. How do we bring that out in them? That this is this can be part of a white supremacist approach, these perceptions of superiority around your identity. Developing a culture of inclusion and belonging. How do we work responsively with colleagues, students, and families who might have different cultures than us or come from some culturally different practices? How do we recognize and learn how to interrupt deficit narratives? This idea that, it's the family, they're this, they're that, it's the problem, it's the community, it's everything but us, it's everything but our problem. And microaggressions. How do we help them to use language to interrupt statements, conversations, decision-making right at the table, so that we can begin to address some of the language and culture of our schools? And strategies for valuing and identifying evidence that tells the whole story. Is it all about standardized testing? How do we get voices out from people who are not having the same experience as the average student in the school? And then how do we take that data and not put our own spin on it so that we get, we're using confirmation bias in the way? Because I think a lot of this idea of evidence-based decision-making is great, except if you're going to take the evidence and you're going to twist it or manipulate it in a way that just confirms what you thought to begin with. So we have to be careful to assume that because we use data, we're using it in a way that's really truthful. So those are some challenges. And then offering models that offer concrete steps. Again, this idea of talking concept, but no real way for them to get there. This is an example of a model I've been using this past year that students really like. I found it online just by accident, and it's a becoming anti-racist model, and it gives really specific things like, I surround myself with others who think and look differently than me. So we have conversations about that. I have a colleague who may be on this call who has actually had students keep journals of who they hang out with during the week and what their contact is with people of a different race. How many hours are you spending? And what's that conversation? And what's your position of power in there? And this really can help to get people to understand that the segregation, the housing segregation that we live in, and how we segregate ourselves socially impacts the way you will or will not interact with people as a school leader. So giving them models like this that are really specific about, here's one, I educate my peers about how racism harms our profession. These are action steps that we can take. And I ask people, which ones would be really hard for you to do right now? Which ones are you doing right now? Give an example. I talk about, joining a gym purposely in an urban area. I have options. I live in a suburban area. It's largely white. I belong to a gym in that area, but I wanted to join a gym again, and I decided not to join in my community. I decided to join in another community with the hope that maybe I'll have an opportunity to spend more time with people that are socioeconomically, racially, ethnic differently than me. Choices. So giving them models like that. So what curricular choices have you tried, and what's working for your candidates? Have you found good models? Have you created assignments that you feel that are kind of novel, that are sort of getting some movement on the dial? What do you think? You must be doing something you like, something that you're like proud of, something that you feel, oh, I got something from them. I see, I'm getting some emotion from them. I'm getting some really great introspection. For example, I added a racial autobiography to my social justice course. And this has been very eye-opening for many of them. And then I have them write a journal about what it was like to write the racial autobiography. I have people talking to their parents and their spouses about things they've never discussed, clarifying with family members things that happened as a child that they didn't understand. So I think that's been really helpful. My question to myself is, how do I provide appropriate feedback? So that's an example of something that I've done. I've taken all of my journal entries, all of them now are reflexive, not reflective. They have an opinion. They have to then tie it to, what am I doing? What does it look like in my practice? Or what might I need to be working on? This is helping. I mean, these are not, cures. This is not, changing the world, but I'm seeing a change. How about you? What are you seeing?
If I can just add, one of the things we do with our candidates, with our students, and so just to contextualize that, the Master of Educational Leadership or Master of Education in Educational Leadership at our university or in any university in Australia is not compulsory. So our students come to us because they want to learn about leadership or are already in a leadership position. They might be principals, aspiring principals, deputy principals, middle leaders, or teachers who are just interested. But for those in particular who are already in leadership positions and who have hiring responsibilities, one of the things we talk to them about is, how is this going to make you think differently about the people that you hire? Because one of the things we like to do is, as you were saying, Deirdre, is hire people who are like us. We don't talk about it like that, but that's what we do. And so trying to break some of the molds that already exist. And another thing that we do, so we talk about hiring and shifting more perspectives in decision making. And so that can only enhance what happens in schools. And the other thing we do is that we have as a result of national transparency and accountability in our three systems of education, government, Catholic, and independent, is that we have a website, a public website, anyone in the world can have a look at it, where you can put the name of any school in Australia in any of those systems and have a look at their demographics, their socioeconomic status, family status, their finances. And so we do an activity where we invite our students in groups to go into certain schools. We choose some that we know are going to be good for this activity, and say, well, what are some, if you're the principal of that school, if you're an assistant principal or a middle leader, what are some of the challenges, and where are those tensions and pressures coming from? So, for example, in a school that might be independent, which for us means private, very high fees to pay, very expensive, quite elite, girls only or boys only. Sometimes they tend to be single sex. And you want to bring this across. It's probably going to be very white, very, very affluent. What are some of the tensions you're going to get? How are you going to work through those barriers? So they have to go through them bit by bit. And other cases could be something like a school in a very challenging position, low socioeconomic, where more than half of the families are refugees that have just arrived. And you've got language barrier, you've got cultural barriers. So, how are you going to work around that? What does your staff look like? Do you need to go and recruit people because those children can't see themselves in the adults around them in the school and things like that? So that's working out quite well for us.
That's very exciting that you're focusing on hiring. We don't do too much with the actual process of hiring. And that's so critical because of the questions that you ask of candidates, how you sort those initial applicants that you're even going to look at. I mean, we're working on that as a university. We're working on a hiring guide, an inclusive hiring guide. We'll see when it actually gets sent out there, what the reaction is going to be to this kind of a thing. So I think that's really critical that you're bringing out that the hiring process is not that simple, that you're going to actually have to prepare your staff to hire in a more inclusive way, and that you will get feedback from perhaps the community who sent their children to the school. Perhaps some students were sent to that school to be taught by people who look like them intentionally. We have that where people, they want to be taught, their children taught in an environment that was similar racially and socioeconomically to the one that they were raised in. And that is the reality of a hierarchy, a social hierarchy. So wonderful. How about anyone else want to share on this one? Okay, so let's quickly go to instruction. Again, back to transformative leadership. So obviously we're looking to build these and more. This is more obviously about the ethos of defining transformative leadership. But obviously there's very specific things, as Stephanie mentioned, like the fact that, how does this apply to hiring? How does this apply to supervising teachers in classrooms? How does it apply to discipline? How does it apply to attendance? All these kinds of things. So obviously, this is the approach, and then it has to be applied to all of the kinds of things going on in our schools. So 3 critical reflections in my reflexive work. I'm always asking myself, asking students, what am I learning about myself and who am I? So what? How has this impacted how I judge, treat others, prioritize in my leadership goals and practices? And then now what? So what? So what? Now what? What's my plan? So I realize maybe I have a bias or I don't know very much about a certain thing. So what? How does that impact? How might that impact students? And then what do I want to do about it? What am I going to do to prepare myself to fill that gap? Whether it's hiring people that have a skill set I don't have, going and taking a class in something, doing some reading, joining that gym in that place that's not, spending more time with people that don't look like you or whatever it might be. So these are the sort of the 3 critical questions I'm always pushing them with in terms of instruction. And then I was just talking to a very young and wise person who was talking about the accountability piece. Okay, how do I hold myself accountable now? So if I say that I'm going to spend more time with people who look different than me, what's my plan? And when am I going to come back and revisit that to see if I was successful? So she adds that added layer of where's my accountability for what I said I was going to do? So pairing reflexive activity with accountability practices, setting goals, and then an accountability piece to come back and look at what you did, I think is also an important part of instruction. Online classes, looking at how are responsive in how we teach. So one thing I've been doing in my social justice class is allowing them to respond to journals using drawings. They can record by voice. They can record in their home language if it's more comfortable for them with a translation for me, so that if it helps them to initially think out their ideas better in writing or verbally, as long as I get a translation, I'm good with that, So I'm trying to reduce the amount of writing in the class, which is what most asynchronous classes are grading, writing, which puts some people at an advantage, allowing them to use some of their cultural wealth. This is an experiment that I've been doing this semester. And again, allowing recorded group discussions on Zoom as an alternative to written discussion boards. I haven't figured that out because there's just so many groups that I would have to grade, but this is something I'm going to do. And as I said, allowing bilingual possibilities to honor home languages. So this is just a sort of a just ideas that I've been working on. So what I'd like to do is just put you in a room with a few other people for about 5-6 minutes. And Stephanie's going to help me, Cynthia's going to help me with that. And have you discuss these particular questions. And, you can really talk about anything you want with instruction, but, you might talk about supporting your candidates' criticality, strengthening their will to act transformatively, increasing their self-efficacy, so their confidence in their skills, and supporting their accountability for themselves to advance along a transformative journey. These are some things you could talk about. But it could be anything you like about instruction. But I would really focus on what's working rather than talk about what's hard for now, just so we all walk away maybe with one idea. And hopefully we can carry this into later in the year when we come back to the conference. Cynthia, are you?
We stay now.
Hello again. We're back. I hope that that was somewhat, let me just get back to where we were in our slides. So can someone just open their mic and tell us what did you talk about? Did you did you get an idea, or did you do you have something to think about as we end this session? What's something that you talked about?
We talked about using coaching questioning as a way of challenging people's fixed mindsets and helping people to really explore deeply why they think the way they think, and whether or not the barrier that they're talking about or the practice that they're talking about is based in truth or whether it's based in perception. And because they're discovering the answer for themselves, and you're using a non-leading questioning technique in a discursive situation, it helps people to explore the roots of their preconceptions and also to identify them sometimes without you leading them. And I think that then creates an ownership and a greater willingness to change or to accept that transformation is possible or necessary, or whatever the situation they're discussing.
Right. So I think that we need to develop coaching skills, right? You know, I'm not suggesting you don't have them. I'm just saying if you don't have them, then we need to develop them. It's something, I have books on coaching I'm constantly reading because I have a feeling that I lead a little too much. But you know, coaching I think is an important skill, and teaching them to coach, right? So that's a great point. So coaching, someone else. And if you have any coaching resources you think are great, you put them in the chat, Stephanie, for sure. If there's someone you read or find to be particularly effective. Someone else? What'd you talk about in your group? I mean, obviously it takes more than 5 or 6 minutes to really prompt ideas. Amy, did you want to say something? You look like you were going to say something.
Yeah, no, I was just thinking what to say, because we were in a group with one master student and two teachers from Sweden, which is fine, of course. But in my program, we don't focus only on transformative leadership. We focus on so many other things, but we try to develop students' critical thinking in different ways. And one of the ways that we do is that we make them write book logs, or what I don't know what to call them in English quite really, but it's not only a review of the book. They say something about the content of the book, but they also have to say something which is a reflection on something in the book, and then finally some sort of meta reflection where they try to figure out how come that I found this interesting or challenging or wrong in the book. Why do I think like I do? So it's kind of coaching, but it's not one-to-one. It's something they do in writing, and then they take their own logs to they have set study groups during the course, and they discuss their conceptualizations of the books and their ideas and their reflections in the group. So that's one way of actually making people reflect on what they are studying and on research, on course literature and so on.
Excellent. I think what you're talking about is reflexiveness, right? So you're forcing them to connect their feelings, their experiences to what they're reading, and then what, right? So this is that pattern we talk about, is, you know, so that's great. That's wonderful. Yeah, I mean, this is the work in progress that we have to do. So I know that it's time for you to go back to what you were doing, and I want to thank you all for taking time. I know we're all so busy, but to take an hour to just be together and sort of be a fellowship. I hope this has been somewhat helpful in at least opening up some thinking, and maybe you got an idea here or there. And I'll talk to Cynthia about if there's anything more we can do to keep in touch with each other. Here is my email. If you want to talk further, feel free to email me, and then I'm happy to share my cell if anybody wants a conversation, and we can keep this up. So thank you very much, and I hope you have a wonderful day.
Thank you. It was great.
Thank you. Lovely to hear all the thoughts shared.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.